So I just heard the worst advice that I think I've seen in a while from a newly diagnosed LADA diabetic who was giving recommendations for what to eat at Chick-fil-a and how to bolus for it. It was so wildly different from what I know and have experienced, and so I realized that there was maybe a lack of education around different macronutrients and how they affect our blood sugar, not just in the next 15 minutes to 2 or 3 hours, but also up to 6 hours and more later. And so I really just wanted to talk about, one, what he recommended and why I disagree, two, how those different macronutrients, our carbohydrates, our fat, and our protein affect blood sugar levels, how to bolus for them, and what I might eat at Chick-fil-a instead. I am Fiona from Living with LADA. I have been a LADA diabetic for about 4 years now, and now I help other LADA diabetics to find freedom in their A1C so that they don't feel like they are living with disease. I am happy that you're here. If you haven't already, please hit the subscribe button and the like button if you want more info like this, and let's get right into it. So first off, this guy who is a LADA diabetic basically said, what I eat is a 12-count Chick-fil-a nugget meal, and I usually get a fruit cup, and then he didn't really cover the drink very much, but he was talking about how he bolused for the fruit, but didn't really have to bolus for the chicken, but some people might have to bolus for the chicken because there's breading, but it's hard to calculate how much breading there is on the chicken and all of this stuff, which is accurate. For the most part. However, what I noticed was not taken into account is the high fat content of the meal. And so I'm realizing more and more that a lot of diabetics still focus so much on the carbohydrate content of the meal, and they don't understand how protein or fat can actually contribute to our blood sugar levels and our insulin resistance as well. So I really wanted to kind of just touch on those things briefly, give a really high level overview, and then talk about potentially either how to bolus for a high-fat meal like that to prevent high blood sugars later in the day, and also what might be other alternatives or things that you could eat at Chick-fil-a where you don't have to worry as much about that fat coming back to bite you in the butt later. First things first, carbohydrates. They are the fastest thing to affect your blood sugar. In fact, as soon as you put carbohydrates in your mouth, they're already starting to digest thanks to different enzymes in our saliva. So blood sugar can affect us as quickly as 5 to 15 minutes, and it's going to spike our blood sugar the fastest. One of the great things to know about this, though, is that if you are eating a solely carbohydrate meal, and this isn't highly refined, our insulin sensitivity can actually be improved by eating certain carbohydrates. And so while our blood sugar might spike very high very quickly, it also might come down very quickly because things like fruit, some grains, vegetables are actually going to help our insulin work better instead of making our insulin not work as well. We all learn that typically we start with like a 1 to 15 carb ratio, and we learn, okay, one piece of toast is about 15 grams of carbohydrates and things like that. And then we have to actually learn to tailor our insulin ratios to our bodies and how they are affected. We also learn to count carbs in every meal, and there are meals where it's really frustrating and it's really difficult to try to guesstimate how much. It's kind of like that little meme with the blonde chick who's a famous actress, and there's that board in front of her with all the complicated math and she looks confused. Bolusing for diabetes is very often like that, especially starting off and when you're not understanding, how different macronutrients are affecting your blood sugar. So I'm glad that you're here so we can kind of help alleviate some of that pain and heartache. We do want to count our carbohydrates first, and we want to pre-bolus for those carbohydrates. So I always recommend, counting my carbohydrates, learning what they are in different foods, which will come with time and practice, I promise. Otherwise, for everything else, there's Google. Once you bolus for your carbohydrates, that should be coming before your meal, at least about 20 minutes. It takes 15 to 20 minutes for our quick-acting insulin to kick in and start working with your body. If you are using a continuous glucose monitor like the Freestyle Libre or the Dexcom, then fortunately you can see the trends in your blood sugar. So I always recommend waiting until you see that little arrow slightly pointing down before you start eating, because that's how you know, okay, my insulin is now working. And so when you start to eat, there's that other 5 to 15 minutes before the carbohydrates start to affect your blood sugar. And so we can kind of minimize the spikes in blood sugar using that method. Next is a quick little overview on protein. This is definitely something that is going to affect you a lot more if you are someone who eats a more high protein diet, but you won't really have to do much in the way of bolusing for protein if you eat an average amount of protein, but it is good to be aware of, because you might wonder why sometimes you take insulin and your blood sugar just plummets down, and other times you take insulin and your blood sugar won't come down, and then you're giving yourself corrective boluses, sometimes multiple times, and then you get this thing called insulin stacking, where all of that insulin that you've given yourself to try to bring down your high blood sugar all of a sudden hits you at once, and then you have this crazy low where you eat everything in sight, and then it just spikes right back up, putting you in this really terrible cycle. So it's important to know that protein does affect your blood sugar, but what it does is a very, very slow, gradual increase, not as high as other macronutrients, and then it just stays stable, and it does make you a little bit more insulin resistant. So if you eat a lot of protein, say like 100 grams, 120 grams, like is kind of the trend in diets right now, and for great reasons, right? But if you are one of those people who's eating a lot of protein and you notice that like, hey, my blood sugar is in range a lot of the time, but it's high. If it's high and stable, all of that high protein can actually contribute to your high and stable blood sugar. And that's really the main reason or main way that protein can kind of affect us as far as like noticing that trend and bolusing for it, at least that I have noticed and researched myself. And all of that brings us to fat. So fat is the trickiest one in my opinion, because it's not quite as predictable and it always hits you later than you expect. So what happens with fat is that it is also converted into sugar in our blood. It just takes our body a lot longer to do that. Whereas carbohydrates may affect you right away, right? And it may last 2 or 3 hours and come down. Right at the end of that time is typically around the time when fat starts to spike our blood glucose. So you get this little spike from your carbohydrates, and then you get another spike from fat. And the only thing about fat that I think really is tricky, besides bolusing correctly for it, is that it makes you more insulin resistant. So when you have that high fat elevation, you'll notice that you might take more and more insulin, or give yourself a correction, or you've bolused for a lot more than just the carbohydrates, but maybe you've doubled that to account for the fat. Or maybe you've bolused for the carbohydrates and you have that delayed bolus that like some pumps will do, where it gives you another one 2 or 3 hours later, equal to or more or a little bit less, and that's supposed to help bring that fat spike down. In case you didn't know, the fat does not move the same as the carbohydrates because it has actually made you temporarily more resistant to your insulin. So that's really important to notice. And why do I bring that up is because when we're talking about Chick-fil-A chicken nuggets, those are deep fried in fat. And so while you may have to only account on the front end for the carbohydrates in like the breading and the carbohydrates of the fruit that again give you that sort of like quick spike and then it comes right down. And if you pre-bolus, maybe that stays level, which is awesome. But then you're going to get to that point where all of that fat is hitting your bloodstream and we go up and stay up and don't come down even with corrections. So it's really important to notice like, hey, this is something that could happen, that might happen, that probably will happen. And then how do I treat that if it does? So like we talked about, you can have the delayed bolus where maybe an hour or 2 hours after you've eaten, your pump automatically gives you another dose of insulin, or you give yourself another shot of insulin to help account for that fat. Now that is tricky because everybody's bodies react differently to insulin, and so you really have to kind of play around safely with how much to give yourself and make sure that you are waiting that recommended 2 hours before, if you are especially on the shot, before giving yourself another correction, because we want to give enough time for that insulin to work so that we don't end up doing that whole insulin stacking thing that we were talking about earlier. How I would bolus for it is going to be different than someone else does, which is really why it's important to have a tailored approach to you and your body. And that trial and error is also extremely important, but to do that safely and with guidance is obviously the best and safest way to do that. For me personally, I have to give myself all of the insulin on the front end as a pre-bolus to avoid the 2 spikes, right? So my carbohydrate spike and then my later fat spike. I give myself all of that insulin on the front end. And that works for me because I end up having a little bit less of the fat spike, and then I don't have to give myself as much of a correction later if I do have to give myself a correction. Now that might not work for you because maybe you give yourself all of that insulin on the front end, but maybe you're more insulin sensitive. And so it combats the carbohydrate spike and stays level, but then it plummets. So this is the important thing to kind of learn and tailor to yourself. Maybe you're one of those people, since you're more insulin sensitive, right, where you tailor it and bolus for the carbohydrates, and then after that 2 to 3 hours, depending on your body and what you've eaten, then we know, okay, I need to give myself about this much for that fat spike so that we can spend more time in range and more time at our target blood sugar, which is always, always, always the goal. So last thing is that we're eating at Chick-fil-a, right? So what do we eat at Chick-fil-a as a LADA diabetic? It's a great question. It's a fair question. And while there are times when, hey, I'm just going to eat some chicken nuggets or a deep fried chicken sandwich, and that's okay, as long as you've learned how to bolus for that food and you know that you're doing it and you're doing it in moderation, that's awesome. Eat your chicken sandwich, your chicken minis, whatever. The fruit is great because, like I mentioned earlier, fruit does help increase your insulin sensitivity. It's going to be a lot healthier alternative to your French fries, for sure, or the macaroni and cheese with the soybean oil and all that stuff in it, which actually is just like the deep fried fat that's going to do the same thing and give you that spike later. I would always recommend something like the grilled chicken wrap. You can do the fruit or you can do French fries and just know that, we're limiting the fat. So if I'm going to have a chicken sandwich and it's deep fried, maybe I'm not going to have deep fried French fries. If I'm going to have the wrap, I can do fruit with that, or I can indulge in some French fries and just know to bolus. But doing the high fat meal, remember that's going to affect your blood sugar. So trying to balance it, maybe picking one item to indulge in and then the other one being healthier is a great option. Or if you were to do the wrap with like the kale side or the wrap with the fruit cup, a salad, things like that are always great. Remember that protein can also help stabilize your blood sugar. So if you are eating something like the salad or like the wrap, that protein in the chicken is going to help your carbohydrates to spike your blood sugar a little bit slower, and it's going to help keep you satisfied for longer. So there are lots of great options to eat there. Really, it's about finding balance and not depriving yourself so much that you lose all control and binge, but it is good to know what are some different options and how do I bolus for all of those options. So I really think that finding that pattern of how different micronutrients affect your blood sugar and how you need to bolus and tailor your boluses for those is extremely important. So I hope you found this helpful. If you did, please hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. I'll be posting more great content like this to educate new LADA diabetics and struggling LADA diabetics so we can find some freedom in our A1Cs. Till next time, thank you guys so much. Bye.